On May 25th, 1979, Soho woke up the same way it did every other spring morning. Delivery trucks humming, shopkeepers rolling up metal shutters, and neighbors exchanging half-awake greetings as they hurried to start their day. But inside one apartment on Prince Street, something far more innocent was unfolding. A little boy tying the straps of his bag, excited for the freedom of walking to the bus stop on his own. Eden Potts was 6 years old, bright-eyed, curious, with a confidence that made him appear older than he was, but still soft around the edges the way only a child can be. He had been asking for days to walk to the bus stop, a short distance from his home. His parents, Stan and Julie, thoughtful and cautious, had finally agreed. It was supposed to be a small step, a milestone, one more gentle nudge toward independence. No one knew that this ordinary morning would become one of the most haunting days in modern American history. Julie, his mother, watched him with the warm pride only a parent could feel. Eden slipped on his favorite little cap, the one that made him look like he had somewhere very important to be. He picked up his book bag, full of the little treasures kids like to carry, pencils, a snack, and a sense of adventure that made the world feel like a safe and inviting place. She gave him a kiss, a smile, and a reminder to go straight to the bus stop. Eden said, "I will," with the easy certainty of a child who believes the world keeps its promises. And then he walked out the door. The hallway smelled faintly of old paint and morning coffee from the neighbors upstairs. Down the stairs he went, pushing through the front door into the cool spring air. The city was alive around him, but for Eden it was just his neighborhood, the familiar sidewalk he'd walked with his parents countless times before. Storefronts were opening, the street was stretching awake, and nothing felt out of the ordinary. He walked down Prince Street the way he'd been taught, practicing the independence he'd been eager to show. The stop where the school bus picked up children was only a short distance away. A simple walk, one that hundreds of children in the city made every morning. But somewhere between the front door of his home and that bus stop, something went wrong. Eden never reached his bus. At first, no one knew. Children missed buses sometimes, mornings were rushed, shoes got lost, time slipped away. But when Eden didn't return home after school, reality shifted sharply. What began as a moment of confusion turned into worry, then into fear, and then into something every parent prays they never have to feel. Stan and Julie's world tilted, every heartbeat suddenly heavy with dread. Authorities were notified. The police responded immediately. And that's when one of the most extensive missing child investigations in American history began. Before social media, before Amber Alerts, before national databases and instant communication, missing children cases were much harder to coordinate. But Eden's disappearance didn't just spark a search, it ignited a movement. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, volunteers pasted flyers on lampposts, strangers handed out pictures of the boy with the soft smile and the curious eyes. Helicopters flew overhead. The media descended on Soho. Eden's face appeared everywhere. New York City had never seen anything like it. Reporters who later reflected on those early hours described a sense of disbelief that something like this could happen in broad daylight, in a neighborhood people trusted. But as the hours stretched into the night, and the night into the next day, the city felt the weight of something unimaginable. A child was missing, and there were no answers. Stan Patz, who was a photographer, used every skill he had to push his son's image into the world. His photographs of Eden were clear, striking, and quickly became symbols. The boy on the milk carton, the face America would never forget. As police retraced every possible path Eden could have taken, the neighborhood held its breath. People asked themselves questions that led nowhere. Was someone watching? Did anyone see something strange? How could a child vanish between one street corner and the next? But even as days passed, the Potts family refused to give up hope. And neither did the community. Detectives followed leads across states. They interviewed neighbors, shop owners, teachers, anyone who had been nearby that morning. A few people remembered seeing Eden walking toward the bus stop, but after that, the trail went cold. The absence of evidence began to feel like a haunting presence of its own. It was as if the city had swallowed him whole. Behind the scenes, the police were piecing together every detail they could. They mapped the neighborhood, interviewed potential witnesses again and again, and began keeping an eye on people who had a history that made detectives uneasy. Among them was a man named Jose Ramos, someone whose connection to the case would stretch on for decades, pulling threads of suspicion even when evidence remained thin. But the truth was, in those early days, the investigation was like reaching into fog. Everyone wanted answers. No one had them. As the weeks turned into months, Eden's story grew beyond New York. His disappearance became a national headline. Families everywhere felt the impact. Conversations about child safety shifted. Awareness surged. And a new era in how America responded to missing children quietly began. Yet through it all, at the center of the chaos and the media and the speculation, there were two parents whose lives had been permanently split in two. The time when Eden was at home, laughing, playing, growing, and the time after. Stan and Julie Patz continued to fight for their son. They kept his room as it was. They kept hope alive, even when it flickered. They moved through each day carrying the weight of not knowing. Sometimes, that's the heaviest weight of all. But the world had not forgotten Eden. And years later, decades later, the case would take a turn no one expected, leading to a confession that raised as many questions as it answered. And that journey, that long stretch of time between the morning he disappeared and the moment investigators believed they finally heard the truth, is where the full impact of this story truly takes shape. Because Eaton Patz did not just vanish. His story changed everything. Night settled over Soho with an uneasy stillness. The streets that normally hummed with artistic energy and late-night conversations felt muted, as though the neighborhood itself understood that something was terribly wrong. Patrol cars rolled slowly past brick buildings and cast careful flashes of blue and red lights on the cobblestones. Officers were knocking on doors, checking alleyways, searching rooftops, every corner that could hide a clue, no matter how small. Inside the Patz apartment, time moved differently. It did not obey the rules of minutes or hours. Every second was stretched thin by fear, every breath heavy. Stan sat with his head in his hands, surrounded by photographs of Eaton laid out on the table. Blown-up prints, school pictures, candid shots, anything that could help. Julie tried to remain composed, but her world was splitting apart in real time, as if someone had quietly removed the floor from beneath her. Their son should have been home. His little footsteps, his chatter, his backpack dropping by the door. Every sound they were expecting that afternoon was now echoing only in memory. And the silence in their apartment felt louder than anything they had ever known. The police promised they were doing everything possible. But even they knew the brutal truth. In the first 24 hours, every minute mattered. And the more minutes passed, the more urgent the situation became. Detective after detective visited the apartment, asking the same questions in different ways. Not because they doubted the parents, but because they needed to hear every detail with absolute clarity. Which way did he walk? Who usually waited at the bus stop? Did he mention anything unusual lately? Did he talk to strangers? Eaton was a friendly child, curious and trusting. The kind of boy with an open heart who saw the world as an invitation rather than a threat. A sweetness that made him beloved by his teachers and friends. But in the eyes of investigators, that innocence was also a danger, because children like him were often the most vulnerable. Outside, volunteers started forming search parties. They fanned out across Soho in groups, flashlights cutting through the darkness. People who had never met the Patz family showed up just to help. They checked stairwells, storage basements, construction sites, anywhere a small child could be hidden out of sight. Flyers were printed and posted on lampposts, telephone poles, and shop windows with the simple, heartbreaking headline, "Missing." As dawn approached, exhausted voices began fading into hoarse whispers, but no one wanted to stop searching. The city that was known for its sharp edges and busy pace suddenly felt united in sorrow. Something about Eaton's disappearance struck a collective chord. Maybe it was his age or the innocence in his face, or the terrifying realization that a child could simply disappear without a trace in a place full of people. By the second day, reporters filled the sidewalks. Microphones, cameras, and notepads documented every update. New York had seen crime, tragedy, and loss many times before, but this case touched a nerve that was different. It made people question the safety of their neighborhoods, the assumptions they held about ordinary routines, and the unspoken belief that children were protected by the familiarity of their surroundings. And as the days turned into weeks, the shock transformed into something else: determination. Detectives built a map on the investigation board, marking every store, every residence, every possible path Eaton could have taken. They circled names, listed individuals with concerning histories, and followed every lead, even the ones that seemed far-fetched. The FBI became involved. Tips poured in from across the country. Some came from people convinced they saw Eaton in another city. Others pointed fingers at neighbors or strangers who seemed off. Some leads were frantic pleas from psychics, insisting they knew the boy's fate. The police checked everything, but there was still no sign of Eaton. In the midst of the growing frustration, one name kept resurfacing: Jose Antonio Ramos, a man with a disturbing history involving children. Ramos had a connection that made detectives pause. He knew the Patz family's babysitter. It was a thread that investigators could not ignore. They questioned him, circled back, questioned him again, and monitored him for years. But even with his long, unsettling record, nothing could be proven. He denied involvement. He changed his story. He hinted at things. He backtracked. He slipped through every crack in the system. To the Patz family, this uncertainty was torture. Still, they fought. Stan became almost relentless. He used every platform he could. His photographs, clear, soulful images of his son, circulated across the country. These were not blurry snapshots. They were powerful, professional-quality images that captured Eaton in a way that resonated with millions. His face soon became one of the first to appear on milk cartons, a symbol that would help redefine how America looked for missing children. Because of Eaton, the country changed. But behind the national movement, the media attention, the conversations about safety, behind all of it were two parents living every day with the crushing ache of uncertainty. They waited through every new tip, hoping for relief, embracing for heartbreak. They spoke to countless investigators, advocates, reporters, and volunteers. They lived in a space where time moved forward, but hope refused to let them move on. And the world kept Eaton's name alive. Years passed. The city changed, the neighborhood changed, families moved in and out, children grew up. But Eaton's story lingered like a shadow over Soho, a silent reminder of a little boy whose life stopped on an ordinary morning. The investigation continued in cycles, spurts of activity whenever new information surfaced, followed by long, quiet stretches where nothing made sense and nothing moved. Theories came and went, suspects emerged and faded. The case became a puzzle with the missing pieces so critical that no one could build a full picture. But in 2012, 33 years after Eaton disappeared, a lead emerged that would shake the case to its core. A confession. One that seemed too sudden, too fragile, and too complicated to easily accept, yet impossible for investigators to ignore. It came from a man named Pedro Hernandez, and his words would change the course of the case forever. But the truth, if it was the truth, would be tangled in questions, doubts, and mysteries that still leave many uneasy to this day. And before the courts, before the headlines, before the final verdict, there was the moment when that confession first slipped into the world and reopened a wound that had never fully healed. For decades, Eaton's case sat in a strange place, neither closed nor forgotten, always hovering in the public consciousness like a question that refused to be answered. As the years passed, technology changed, laws changed. Entire generations grew up hearing Eaton's name, even though they were born long after he vanished. His case became a symbol, a reference point, a reminder of how easily the world could shift under a parent's feet. But then came the spring of 2012, and with it came a sudden, unexpected break. It started with a conversation. A man in New Jersey, sitting at a church prayer group, began speaking words that would ripple through law enforcement circles almost immediately. The man's name was Pedro Hernandez. Quiet, soft-spoken, and seemingly troubled in a way that made the people around him pay attention to what he was saying. According to several accounts, Hernandez confessed that years earlier, as a young man working in a bodega near Prince Street, he had harmed a little boy. He said it almost casually, but the weight behind his words was undeniable. Someone who heard it felt uneasy enough to contact authorities. And when that message reached detectives who had carried Eaton's case in their hearts for decades, everything changed. The moment investigators heard Hernandez's name, they began digging, and what they found surprised them. Hernandez had indeed worked in a bodega close to where Eaton had walked that morning. He had lived in the neighborhood at the time, and he had a history of mental health struggles that made his sudden confession both intriguing and complicated. Investigators brought him in for questioning. Inside the interview room, Hernandez looked fragile, almost haunted. Detectives asked him to walk them through what he was claiming. He spoke softly, haltingly, like someone unearthing memories he had tried to bury for years. He said he had lured Eaton into the basement of the bodega with the promise of a soda. He said he had harmed him there. He said he carried him away afterward. He said he had kept this secret inside him for decades. His words were chilling, not because he spoke with confidence, but because he spoke with a kind of trembling sincerity that felt unsettlingly real. Investigators leaned in, trying to separate truth from confusion, fact from fantasy. False confessions exist, especially among people struggling with mental health challenges. But something about Hernandez's account seemed to fit pieces of the puzzle investigators had never been able to place. They recorded his confession. They took notes. They watched his body language, listened to his pauses, measured every detail. But even as he spoke, a storm was brewing. Because while Hernandez claimed responsibility, he offered no physical evidence, no location, no details that only the perpetrator would know. And yet, he knew something about the morning, something that made detectives stop and ask themselves, could this finally be it? Word spread quickly. The case was reopened publicly. News cameras gathered again. After all these years, old wounds resurfaced. Stan and Julie Patz, who had endured decades of uncertainty, found themselves confronting a new possibility they had learned never to trust too quickly. The public reaction was divided. Some felt relief, finally a suspect willing to speak. Others felt uneasy. Too much time had passed, too much remained uncertain. And lurking beneath it all was a troubling question. Was Pedro Hernandez telling the truth, or was he a vulnerable man lost in his own imagination, claiming guilt he didn't possess? Investigators needed answers. To test the confession, detectives retraced the neighborhood with Hernandez, walking him through old streets, now changed by time. Some landmarks still stood, others were gone. The bodega basement was different. The neighborhood was different. Memories were blurred by decades of fading. Still, Hernandez pointed, gestured, tried to explain where things had happened. But memories are tricky, especially after so long, and especially when they exist in the mind of someone who has struggled mentally for years. The case moved toward trial, but it was not a straight path. Legal teams debated the reliability of Hernandez's confession. Defense attorneys argued that he was easily influenced, that he suffered from delusional thinking, that he had a low IQ and a fragile mental state that made him prone to false admissions. They pointed out that he had confessed to family members before, but only vaguely, inconsistently. They questioned whether he even understood what he was saying when he spoke. Prosecutors countered that his confession was too detailed to ignore, that his connection to the neighborhood was real, that his guilty conscience had finally pushed him to speak after decades of silence. The Patz family stood quietly at the center, navigating the turbulence with the emotional endurance they had developed over 33 painful years. They listened to the arguments. They watched the interviews. They weighed the same questions the world was asking. But there was something deeper happening beneath the surface, something harder to explain. After so long without answers, even a flawed possibility felt like a door finally cracking open after being sealed shut for decades. Yet the fear remained. What if this was another dead end? What if they allowed themselves to hope one more time, only to be disappointed again? The first trial began in 2015. The courtroom was packed. Journalists filled the seats. Curious onlookers waited in the back. And every witness who took the stand did so under the weight of a story that had shaped American history. Hernandez sat quietly at the defense table, small in stature, avoiding eye contact. Prosecutors played the recording of his confession. The jury watched his trembling voice, his nervous movements. Some jurors looked moved, others looked uncertain. The defense presented testimony from mental health experts. They spoke about Hernandez's susceptibility to suggestion, his years of hallucinations, his fragile grasp of reality. They argued that he did not know what was real and what was not. The trial stretched on for weeks. Jurors deliberated for days, but in the end, they could not reach a unanimous verdict. The trial ended in a hung jury. The case, after 3 decades of waiting, was still unresolved. And yet the story was far from over. What followed was a second trial, a new jury, new testimony, a second chance at finally answering the question that had lingered since 1979. But even as the legal battle continued, one thing grew increasingly clear. Aiden Potts' story had become bigger than the courtroom, bigger than any suspect, bigger than any theory. It had become a symbol of a nation waking up to the urgent reality of child safety, a catalyst for change, and a reminder of how one child's disappearance reshaped an entire system. In that second trial, the one that finally delivered a verdict in 2017, would mark the moment the world received an answer. One that brought closure for some and deeper questions for others. The lead up to the second trial carried a strange energy, part anticipation, part exhaustion. After more than 35 years, most cases like this would have long faded from public memory. But this wasn't most cases. Eden's disappearance had shaped national policy, redefined parental fears, and become a symbolic wound embedded in the culture of a country that had once believed the missing child case could never stretch across generations. Now in 2017, a fresh jury sat quietly in the courtroom, listening as both sides presented their arguments again. This wasn't just a legal proceeding, it felt like a final opportunity to uncover what happened on that May morning in 1979. Prosecutors stood before the jury with renewed focus. They replayed Hernandez's confession, his trembling voice, his pauses, the subtle hesitations that made his words feel heavy, as though each sentence carried a burden he had held too long. They pointed to the consistency in key details. They described how he had told family members in the past that he hurt a child in New York. They reminded the jury that Hernandez had been in the area at the right time with access to a secluded basement. They framed the confession not as a moment of confusion, but as a release of a guilt that had eaten at him for decades. But the defense team pushed back with equal force. They described Hernandez as a vulnerable man with a long history of mental instability. They laid out his struggle with hallucinations and delusional thinking. They argued that he was easily influenced, prone to blending dreams with reality. They questioned whether the police interrogation had unintentionally shaped his answers. They insisted that the confession was unreliable, an echo created by suggestion, not truth. The courtroom became a battlefield of psychology versus instinct, law versus uncertainty, fact versus interpretation. Jurors watched carefully as Hernandez sat at the defense table, his posture small, his face down, as though shrinking under the weight of the attention. He looked nothing like a man capable of violence, some observers said, but then others reminded themselves that appearances mean little in cases like this. Witness after witness took the stand. Someone who once knew Hernandez said he had confessed to them years ago quietly, almost in passing. A mental health expert testified about memory distortion and susceptibility. A detective explained the interrogation process step by step, defending the integrity of the investigation. And all the while, at the front of the courtroom, Stan and Julie Patz sat listening. Their faces calm, but their eyes filled with decades of waiting for something solid, something final. For more than 5 weeks, testimony filled the courtroom. And when it was finally time for the jury to deliberate, they withdrew into the quiet room where 12 people would weigh the future of the case. Unlike the first trial, deliberations this time were long, but not endless. The tension was heavy, but the jurors appeared focused, determined to resolve what the previous group could not. And then, one afternoon, the courtroom was called back to order. The jury had reached a verdict. People hurried into the wooden benches. Reporters prepared their notes. Cameras waited outside, anticipating the outcome of a case that had spanned 2 generations. The Potts family sat still. Pedro Hernandez stood as the judge asked the foreperson to read the verdict. Guilty. The word hung in the air like a long-held breath finally released. Hernandez was found guilty of kidnapping and murder. For Stan and Julie Patz, the moment was not filled with celebration or triumph. There were no cheers, no smiles. Instead, what crossed their faces was something quieter, something closer to relief, or perhaps the closest thing they could accept as justice after so many years. They had lived with an open wound for decades. No verdict could undo that pain. No confession, no conviction could return their child. But the acknowledgement, the official recognition of responsibility, offered a measure of closure that had been denied to them for so long. Outside the courthouse, the world responded. News outlets reported the verdict in headlines across the country. Commentators revisited the case, experts debated the strength of the evidence, and the public revisited the story of the boy who had symbolized a nationwide awakening to child safety. But beyond the noise, beyond the legal arguments and public reactions, a simple truth stood firm. The case of Etan Patz had finally reached a point of resolution. Hernandez was sentenced to serve 25 years to life in prison. It was the result of a long and complex journey, A journey that had begun with a little boy excited to walk to his bus stop and had led to a courtroom nearly 4 decades later. Yet even with the verdict, something deeper lingered, a debate that would continue for years after the conviction. Some believed wholeheartedly that the right man had been found. Others questioned the reliability of the confession and the lack of physical evidence. Some felt uneasy that a case so emotionally charged had hinged almost entirely on the words of a man with documented psychological challenges. But the justice system had spoken, and the Potts family, with grace and quiet strength, accepted that judgment. Still, even with the legal chapter closed, the symbolic impact of the case would continue to shape the nation. Eaton's disappearance sparked major reforms. Parents across the country became more cautious. Schools revised their protocols. Police departments improved communication systems. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children was created, ushering in modern approaches to locating missing kids. Child faces on milk cartons became a cultural phenomenon, Eaton's among the first and the most widely recognized. May 25th was designated as National Missing Children's Children's Day, a yearly tribute to the countless families who have walked the same painful path the Potts family once did. Eaton's story redefined how America thought about missing children. It brought attention, resources, and urgency to a crisis that had quietly existed in the background for too long. But beneath the nationwide impact, beneath all the structural reforms and laws and awareness campaigns, remains the heart of the story. A little boy with soft eyes and a trusting smile. A family with endless love. A community that rallied. A country that learned. A tragedy that changed everything. And yet, one question endures. Even with the verdict, even with the confession, even with the sentence, did we ever truly know what happened to Eaton Potts that morning? Some believe the answer is yes. Others, quietly, still wonder. But the most important truth remains. Eaton's story will never be forgotten. In the years following the verdict, life in Soho continued to move forward. New families moved into the neighborhood. Old buildings were renovated. Cafes and boutiques replaced the dusty storefronts that once stood along the route Eaton walked that morning. The city, ever evolving, ever restless, carried on as it always had. But for those who lived through it, or studied it, or simply cared enough to remember, the case of Eaton Potts remained a quiet echo that drifted through the city's history. A reminder that beneath New York's steel and noise and relentless energy, there were stories that left permanent marks, stories that would never fade with time. Eaton's parents, Stan and Julie, continued living in the same apartment on Prince Street for many years. They kept pieces of their son's life intact, photographs, memories, the room that once held the joy of a little boy waking up for school. They became advocates for change without ever seeking the spotlight. They showed a level of strength that many admired, but few could fully comprehend. For them, closure never meant forgetting. It meant acknowledging the truth the court had settled on. It meant allowing the law to say what they had waited decades to hear. It meant accepting resolution, even if it arrived without the physical evidence that so many people longed for. They never stopped loving their son. They simply learned to live with the unanswered questions. In many ways, Eaton's story became larger than any single moment or life. It became part of a national memory. A turning point, a moment when America realized that protecting children required more than good intentions. It required systems, coordination, awareness, and urgency. And those changes came. Schools adopted new policies. Parents became more cautious. Law enforcement agencies improved communication. Missing child cases gained protocols that once didn't exist. Eaton's face, once printed on milk cartons, taped to lampposts, and shared across television screens, became a symbol of vulnerability, hope, and the determination to bring every child home. Not all stories ended with answers, but because of Eaton, more stories began with faster action, clearer guidelines, and better tools. Even decades later, his legacy lived quietly in every Amber Alert, every missing person poster shared in minutes instead of days, every coordinated search that happened with precision instead of chaos. His story was a wound, yes, but also a catalyst, a reminder, a lesson, a name carved into the heart of a country that learned, painfully, that innocence should never be taken for granted. But beyond the national impact, beyond the symbolism, there was something simpler, more human, something that kept the story alive in conversations, documentaries, articles, and the memories of those who followed the case. It was the image of a small boy waking up on a spring morning filled with excitement, a child who wanted to walk to the bus stop on his own, a moment meant to mark independence, not tragedy, a life that should have been long and full and overflowing with experiences he never got to see. And so, each year on May 25th, when National Missing Children's Day comes around, many pause for a moment. Some think of Eaton directly. Others think of the families who still search. Some think of the systems that now exist because a little boy never made it to his bus. It is a day marked not by sorrow alone, but by remembrance and a renewed commitment to protect children, to raise awareness, to never become numb to the urgency of a missing child. Because of Eaton Potts, the world changed. Because of his parents, the system changed. Because of his story, millions of children are safer today. And though the passing years have polished the sharp edges of grief into something quieter, the story still matters. Deeply, powerfully, irrevocably. It matters because it reminds us that behind every headline, is a family who wakes up every day with an ache that never fully heals. It matters because it teaches us that justice, even decades late, can still bring a measure of peace. It matters because some stories shape who we become, as parents, as communities, as a society. Eaton's story is one of them. A little boy whose life was short, but whose impact will outlive generations. A name the world will not forget. And as long as his story continues to be told, with care, with respect, with truth, his memory continues to shine as a reminder of both the fragility of childhood and the strength of those who fight to protect it. Eitan Patz, May 25th, 1979. A name that helped change the world. A light that never truly went out. And that is the story. A story that shook a family, shook a city, and reshaped an entire nation. As we look back on the disappearance of Eitan Patz, we're reminded of how fragile safety can be and how one moment can change everything. But I want to hear from you. Do you believe justice was truly served? Do you think the confession was real? Or was the truth lost somewhere along the way? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. And if you found this story powerful, emotional, or eye-opening, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. We tell stories that matter here. Stories that deserve to be remembered. Stories that raise questions long after the video ends. Thank you for watching. Take care of yourself and take care of the people you love. Until next time.